We're going to dive into a little bit of functional anatomy, and today we're going to go after one of the big guns. We're going to talk Latissimus dorsi. Now I've highlighted it here for you on the screen so you can see it. Let's very quickly just orientate ourselves around where the muscle sits from an anatomical perspective. Now we have our origin points running around the pelvis and then up the spine up to about T7. But the bits I really want to focus on today, because it's going to help us to understand a little bit about how it might impact our training, or have an impact in our training environment, and also potential compensations and issues around the shoulder, is our insertion points on the front of the humerus here. I'm just going to highlight it through for you so you can see it. So right here on the anterior aspect in the intertrabecular groove. And then for most people, we're also going to have attachments on the scapula as well. So if we think about what the lat does from a functional perspective, it's going to act on both the humerus and on the scapula, which means that it has a big role to play in managing, controlling, or influencing shoulder function. The lat dorsi is going to extend internally or medially rotate and adduct the humerus. From a scapular perspective, it can depress, adduct the scapula, and downwardly rotate. So it plays a big role in this, as I said, in this shoulder movement. Now, one thing I want you to think about around this is what happens if we've got that lat working super hard. Sometimes we find people that have done a lot of loaded carries, like heavy carry work, if we've done a lot of work around sort of pull-ups, deadlift patterns, something where the lat is going to be super involved from either a movement or stabilization perspective, we can sometimes find that the shoulder gets depressed. Now, oftentimes we think about front to back balance. So we're starting to think about kind of where the shoulder sits from looking at it from the side on. But we also need to think about what's happening to the shoulder from a top to bottom perspective as well. And if the lat is over dominant or working particularly hard, what it can do is pull the shoulder downwards. Now, if we go back to what we talked about around the functional anatomy, if we've got that lat working super hard, it's going to restrict the movement of the scapula into overhead positions. So remember, the lat can downwardly rotate, depress, and adduct the scapula. When we want to go into overhead positions, we want that scapula to go upwardly rotating around the scapula, around the rib cage, into a position to continue that, or to match that congruency with the humeral head. So anything which is stopping it from going around the rib cage is going to cause a problem. We can also potentially see an issue, whereas if that scapula is being pulled downwards, that we might find an issue around these structures on the front of the shoulder or underneath the acromion process. So here we have the supraspinatus and we've got our long head of biceps. If we've got this real kind of like strong lat pulling downwards, we can often find that that particular supraspinatus could get irritated or aggravated and therefore create some shoulder problems for us. So an example of when I see this would often be in people that have done a lot of bodyweight training or big into pull-ups. They've done a huge amount of work which is super lat dominant, and then when they go into closed kinetic chain pushing movements like handstand push-ups, because of where the load is coming from, we often find that shoulder sitting right down into the bottom into a low depressed position. So the combination of the lat working hard to pull down, and then also where the forces or managing the body position when you're stacked upside down and the hands on the ground, can often mean that we just end up with this shoulder sitting really low. And then sometimes people will feel pain, a pinching sensation as it's often referred to, around the shoulder. So in these situations, one of the things that I think about is, what is lat doing? Do we need to go and think about getting some more range of motion? Do we need to consider this top to bottom balance that I mentioned, and whether we put an intervention around to try to improve that position? Those are some of the things that I'm thinking around lat dorsi particularly, and a specific example of where I see common problems. But if you find that you've done a lot of work which is like loaded carries, as I said, heavy training, if that lat is pulling the shoulder down, start to think about how you can go about getting more range of motion and adjusting that position by helping to get more shoulder elevation to put the shoulder in a more optimal position. And it will help you then to start to also get into better overhead positions and stop that scap from being pulled down by some potentially pretty powerful musculature around that lat dorsi. So there's a bit of an overview around what we might be thinking around the lat dorsi. There's lots of other things, but I hope that helps when you're going through and working in your own training program or with your clients.